All right, took a break for the day. We're back. We're going to dive into Professor Layton with Professor Layton 1. These chapters were split up really weirdly in terms of like how the actual game considered them to be chapters, but for our intents and purposes, it's actually very easy to rank them, as each court case basically is the trial and then all of the latent stuff leading up to it, which is pretty interesting in and of itself, because that ultimately means that this game had no actual investigations. It was basically, as far as Phoenix Wright was concerned, just trials. Because instead of the investigations, you instead had just a bunch of latent puzzles and basically like the setup for each chapter leading up to the climax that was the Phoenix Wright trial. You got all your evidence in the actual courtroom, and so it was very difficult for this game to do like a lot of too complex stuff with its cases, at least until the end. We'll get to that in a bit. So a lot of these cases, despite the like crazier themes of the game of magic and whatnot, were actually very simple. And this is one of the best examples of that. This is an assault case. This is like the only assault case that I think is on this list. It's not a murder case. And I think that starting with Layton in the game, like you started with the Layton section, made me, as someone who was there just for Ace Attorney, a lot more excited when you actually got to play as Phoenix Wright and actually pick up the mantle of this case and actually take up your place in the English courtroom. I thought that was really cool. Was also kind of reminiscent of Great Ace Attorney Chronicles because I played those games first, so I knew what it was like to practice court in Britain, as they say. This was kind of a fun little throwback to that, at least for me. And by the time you were actually in the defendant's chamber about to go into court, I was really excited. I was getting really excited. For reference, I played like the Ace Attorney trilogy, and then I played like Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, and then I played the Edgeworth games, and then I played this game, and then I played the Apollo Justice trilogy. So that was my timeline for like Ace Attorney specifically. And because I was like waiting so long for the Apollo Justice trilogy to come out, I was pumped when I first got into this game. I was really excited for this case. I also think that aside from just the general hype that I had like going into this case, like the build up and like saying, oh yeah, it's finally time for Phoenix Wright after playing for Professor Layton for what felt like 2 or 3 hours, I also found the initial premise of this case to be very exciting because we knew, or at least we thought, that magic was afoot, and Espella was obviously being mind controlled and brainwashed, and I love mind control brainwash concepts when they're done correctly and when they're done interestingly. And a lot of times I'm real disappointed when I see these concepts in media because I never feel like they're done like to their fullest potential. I never feel like mind control is used to the extent that it could be used. And so when I saw that we had like a mind controlled client here, I was very interested. I really wanted to know like what they were gonna do with Espella confessing to the crime. I didn't know what Darklaw's motives were. Obviously she was set up in this case for you to perceive her as a villain, maybe even the overarching villain of the whole game. This game had a lot of misdirection in what you're supposed to like interpret your first impressions of characters and whatnot, and I was really intrigued going into the courtroom. How they set up brainwashed Espella, what Darklaw was doing. I was invested to the maximum extent going into this case. And unfortunately, we didn't get much payoff for it. Brainwashed Espella does like nothing the entire case. Darklaw does like nothing the entire case. I think it is really cool that they invented an English pain equivalent just for the sake of prosecuting this case. I do think that's very cool. I felt like he was the tutorial humor prosecutor decently well, but the puzzles were really simple. The chocolate on the hands thing and the blue badger doll. Nice blue badger nod to the mainline Ace Attorney series. This game had a lot of nods like that, and maybe I was just good at Ace Attorney by now, but this case was just very easy, beat for beat. It was predictable, and unfortunately did not at all live up to the hype and like the things that I really wanted to see going forward, going into this case, from Brainwashed Espella, from Darklaw, from these new characters that had me hooked immediately. didn't get much payoff here. The culprit was nothing too impressive. This case didn't even really wrap up all that neatly because we never figured out who hit her in the head, because this case is just basically supposed to set up all of the magical land nonsense. It was really exciting to be playing Phoenix Wright in this game, and that just by itself made this case kind of a thrill ride, just being back in the driver's seat as Phoenix Wright after having not played as Phoenix Wright for so long, at least to me personally. Aside from the fact that the game gives you that sensation itself because you spend so much time with Layton at the beginning of the game, and when you switch over to Phoenix Wright, like I said, there's no investigation segment. You're just thrown into the real meat of Ace Attorney, being the attorney. So even though the actual content here wasn't that great and it didn't live up to my expectations, it was still fun playing as Phoenix Wright again. The case also doesn't overstay its welcome. I feel like this is an example of one of those cases where if it would have been longer, or maybe if it would have had an investigation section, I would have ranked it lower, just because the case doesn't really do all that much that I wanted it to, just gonna be honest. But you could also argue that that build-up and stuff for Brainwashed Espella and for Darklaw were like very interesting elements that carried over into the future cases, because it's not like Espella's brainwashing breaks at the end of this case. She's still brainwashed, and then Phoenix Wright and Maya stumble into Storybrook or wherever it's called in this game, just by accident at the end of the case. Again, this case is like all set up. Its story isn't really as compact for a tutorial case. Like a lot of these tutorial cases, like this one as well, a lot of these earlier Ace Attorney tutorial cases told sort of a compact story. This was almost all set up, and I feel like that's why it didn't have as many of the payoffs as I would have liked. And I do want to give it points for it building up, getting you to want to play Phoenix Wright so well that by the time you were actually playing him, it just felt like such a fun experience. Much more so than like any of these other games. I feel like no other game in the Ace Attorney trilogy built up actually getting to the courtroom as well as this case did. So there's some very unique props I can give it there, and it did just make playing what is essentially a normal case a lot more fun than it would have been in any other game, but that doesn't make the actual content of the case any more interesting. So it's a very difficult case to rank, but for completely different reasons than all of the cases that were difficult to rank up here were. It's gonna go somewhere in one of these three tiers, unfortunately. As much as I loved some of the plot points they set up here, and as fun as it was to get into being in court with Phoenix again, it still wasn't that great. And once you actually step into the courtroom from the defendant lobby, there's not much there that really makes me want to revisit it either. I feel like it's appropriate to put this case somewhere in meh tier, because I don't think it's more bad than good. I guess technically it is, but I wouldn't really describe it that way, because it's not like supposed to be a sort of standalone experience like one of these two cases. It's more of an introductory, and I feel like just because it makes me enjoy coming back to court a lot more in this case than it does in this case, I'm gonna put it above it. I do think it's meh. It is kind of a slog. There's not really much interesting going on in the courtroom. Maya's there straight from the get-go, so that's good. Voice acting.
Wow, look, it's really London. Come on, Nick, take a look.
I know you're excited, Maya, but can a guy get a few last Z's in?
This is no time to be sleeping.
Flinch will take care of everything.
He's treating us like amateurs, Nick.
Oh boy, this looks bad.
This is like the first time Phoenix and Maya are voice acted outside of the anime or Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And you also sort of have to rank the like Layton stuff as well, which is not something I'm really taking into consideration because I don't really enjoy the Layton puzzles. But as far as plot goes, it builds up the court case in the same manner that an investigation segment would. So even though it doesn't have them, it still has the benefit of being able to establish foundation for the case before you go into the courtroom. And so for those reasons, I don't want to put it down here. I don't think it's more bad than good. I want to put it in meh. I think it could have been so much better. Unfortunately, when we see Espella again, she is not brainwashed. I would have liked to see, well, technically she is, right? But we'll get to that later. I would have liked to see a lot more of brainwashed Espella and like Darklaw acting as her teacher, Miss Darklaw. I feel like there's a lot of missed potential here, and that's what a lot of people say about Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright in general, because they didn't want to fully commit to there being magic in universe for either of these two franchises, or at least for Phoenix Wright, I guess. And while some of what they did is crazy, I feel like, at least in this first case, there was a lot of missed potential and it could have been a lot better. But for a setup for the game overall, it is serviceable. Next, we have Professor Layton 2, and holy crap, this case, I'm just gonna say it outright. This case, over half the trial for this case is figuring out, could Espella have been holding a stick? I'm not kidding. It's absurd how much time you spend of people trying to figure out different ways she could be holding this stick. Like, bro, I need to give some context. For those of you who didn't play this game, don't have means of 3DS emulation, don't want to watch it or whatever, this game introduces the concept of magic and how there's spells and there's crimes being committed with spells, and Espella is basically, even though Maya does get accused of murder in this game, Espella is basically the Maya of this game. You defend Espella in every case except for the one you defend Maya in, because Maya has to get accused of murder in every game that she's in, naturally. But Espella just cannot catch a break. She's just accused of murder in the real world and in the fantasy world, even though the fantasy world is real. We'll get to that later. So when I say this case is all about, could Espella have been holding a stick? It's because they establish that witches, it's literally like a play on the Salem witch trials. That's what the game is. Witches need staffs to cast magic spells, and we were trying to figure out what, like, her hands were full because she was like holding milk or something, and like someone like grabbed her hand. Could she have been holding this staff to cast the fireball spell? And the amount of different ways that High Inquisitor Barnum, or whatever the F clown man's name was, the number of ways he comes up with to suggest she could have possibly been holding this stick is ludicrous. You spend so much time on it that it's hard for me to even talk about anything else in this case, because they spend so much time on, well, maybe her hand was through the milk carton, maybe it was on her back and she reached around and touched it. So much time spent in court. Could she have been holding the stick or not? It's so much of the case. It's so much of it. It's obscene. Almost nothing leading up to this case foreshadows a court case. I actually feel like this case did a better job of building up the fact that you were going to go into court and defend Espella. Almost nothing in this case gave you the inclination that a murder was about to happen, outside of like the cutscene, of course, where a witch casts Ignace and like sets two guys on fire. Aside from the cutscene, there's almost no build-up to the actual case itself. It's just world building and lore for the overarching story of the game throughout the entire Layton segments, which, again, I didn't enjoy the Layton segments. Huge L as far as I'm concerned. So basically, whenever I get to the actual court case in Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright, I'm in a good mood and I'm enjoying it because I'm glad to actually get to the Phoenix Wright stuff that I'm there for. So I just want to make it clear that even though I might rank some of these Layton cases lower on the list, when I got to them in game, man, was I having a blast to finally be doing some stuff I was really enjoying. There's also some really interesting dynamics you see with Phoenix and Maya before the courtroom segment of this case. You see them think that they're bakers and have no memory of being lawyers, and you're like, what the F is going on, man? This place is wacko. And I thought that was very interesting. Phoenix Wright, all of this case, doesn't have his memories back before he steps into court. They did it again. They did it to the man again. I I do want to give this game props for having multiple witnesses on the witness stand. This case did use some of the like great Ace Attorney mechanics where there was like multiple witnesses on the stand at a time and you had to see them react to each other. That was something that was in Layton, and I feel like that was something that could have been in like the later couple of games in the Apollo Justice trilogy and just wasn't. And so I'm glad that it got to be explored with modern characters like Apollo or Phoenix Wright in this game. And I did enjoy that, so props to the case there. These witnesses are mostly just clowns, though. They're kind of reminiscent of Great Ace Attorney Chronicles witnesses. It's very hard to take them seriously, like the knight with the flimsy sword. The only one I really took seriously is Kira, and guess what? It's because she's the killer. Because Phoenix Wright hates waifus. And once you get past the stick BS and you actually get to like, she was invisible and she like moved around and like called out the name of the spell. She's calling out to some guy. We'll get to that in a second. That half of the case is actually very interesting. And also, this chapter is the chapter that introduces the Fantasyland of Storybrooke, whatever they call it in general. And it is pretty interesting to learn about, doubly so when you get to the court, because you get to see the metal effing ways they're dealing with witches, and that crap's disturbing. This case is like Danganronpa levels of disturbing with its executions almost. Ace Attorney doesn't usually get to Danganronpa levels of most things, much less disturbing, which is like Danganronpa's main thing. This case had some disturbing stuff in it, and I gotta give it props for that, because they did some stuff in a crossover game like this that you would not have expected. This being the game that they decide to like introduce the concept of multiple witnesses on the witnesses stand when you're actually playing as Phoenix Wright, I would never have expected that from like a Layton crossover. So there's a lot of really baller moves here. And I respect the devs for it. The devs spent a lot of time on this game, perhaps more than they should have. And the contents of the case, even though it is mostly was she holding the stick, it's sort of like a tutorial case in and of itself. Even though we already had this case as the game's tutorial, this case, like multiple witnesses on the witness stand, it also introduces the grimoire, presenting magical spells as evidence. I actually really like that. It's interesting. We're gonna come back to this, by the way, when we get to Tyree and Cuthbert. If any of you haven't played that game, go play it. But for now, presenting spells was good, and learning about the magic of the world in general was very interesting. I was interested on what kinds of crazy crap the Phoenix Wright writers would come up with when they're able to use magic as a plot device, as something that they incorporate into their trials. And unfortunately, I feel like the Layton half of the game holds it back, because you have to like have half the game be Layton puzzles and world building, and you can't dedicate as much time to like Phoenix Wright to give him actual investigation segments. I feel like they almost constricted themselves in a way by making this game a crossover, and the case didn't come out as well as it could have been as a result. This case also has the introduction of probably the only witness who could potentially contest Lotta Hart as worst witness of all time, and yes, it's that guy. Some guy, excuse me. That's literally what he's referred to throughout this whole case, some guy. And it's a plot point that actually helps you figure out the killer when you figure out what his real name is. And I'm like, you're doing stuff like that in the first case you write, where you can use magic as a plot device? I understand it was tied into the invisibility spell, but I mean, come on, bro. I can't help but feeling there was wasted potential here as well. And again, it's very interesting. It's a novel sensation. Both these cases, it hurts me to rank them low because it was such a unique experience. And I really did enjoy it. Playing through both of these cases and finally getting to the Phoenix Wright half of them where you get to go into court. But I can't forgive this case for how much time it spends on could she have been holding the stick. I just can't. I can't do it. I'm sorry. Also, some guy is an absolute clown in the worst of ways, introducing stupid characters as being very integral to figuring out how the murder happened is never been my preferred way of going through a case and figuring things out and whatnot, and figuring out that you could have figured this out a long time ago if this guy just wasn't stupid. This is why I hate Mike Meekins, by the way. I really want to put it above this case. I really do. But there's no question that this case has more bad than good. A lot of the enjoyment of playing through this case, and this case, is carried by how much the game builds you up to looking forward to switching over to Phoenix Wright from Layton. And is that really something I should rank cases higher for? Because I had to spend so much time doing a portion of the game I didn't really like, that by the time I get to the part of the game that all these cases is like the whole game, it makes it feel more enjoyable, even if the content isn't as high quality. I don't think I should. So it's gonna be another case that goes somewhere in these 3 tiers. It's also sad because I actually liked Kira as a villain. Well, of course they made the cute farm girl the killer, because an ace attorney hates waifus. When she's like executed at the end of this case, I felt really, really bad. That felt like a Danganronpa execution, and I was never expecting to feel like that from an Ace Attorney game. Ace Attorney always makes you feel so glad and happy when you solve the case. You brought him to justice. This case made me feel really bad for Kira. Really bad. Worse than I'd felt for any other Ace Attorney villain ever. Except, like, debatably Catherine Hall, and she wasn't even really a villain. She was just, like, arrested. She wasn't accused of murder, and she definitely wasn't put through the kind of punishment that Kira was in this case. Now, yes, it's revealed it's all fake later, but that made me feel something, and it won't ever make me feel that way again, because these cases don't give you the same sensation replaying them through as you get playing them through the first time. Because if they give you a different one, for sure, like this case, I think, for example, benefits a lot from replayability, and I think that going back and revisiting this case gives you a very interesting perspective on Brainwashed Espella, on Darklaw. I think that those are reasons to play through this case again, even though the actual content of the trial wasn't very interesting. That's also something that keeps this case from being down here, even though like some of the content of this case could be in D tier. This case has a little of that, but not to the same extent. I guess arguably to the same extent, because you can figure out that like everyone present, the killer, the witnesses, everyone are basically just operating on these proxy personalities. So I guess I take that back. It does have replayability. I think this game does have some of the best replayability in Ace Attorney, just because of how drastically different a perspective you have on everything once you know everything that's going on. But I still find myself wanting to come back to these 2 cases so much less than all of these up here, and just this game in general, I suppose. Man, I really feel like it should go in D tier. Like, I really should. Like, for how much they spend on that stick crap, I really should. But I also really want to put it right here, just right in front of this case, because new mechanics, the witnesses, multiple witnesses is very cool. I liked Kira as a killer, even though I felt bad for her. That's good. When a game makes you feel like that, that's really good. I haven't even talked about High Inquisitor Barnum yet. I mentioned him, but that man is pretty darn forgettable. Not really a great prosecutor, IMO. I don't remember like any standout moments from him at all. The biggest standout moment in my memory of High Inquisitor Barnum is in the non-canon DLC where he's trying to give Darklaw a birthday present, and it's kind of cute. That's it. I don't like the man. I don't really think he's a great character. He's like Barack Von Zieks if he has done way worse. I feel like I'm insulting Barack Von Zieks just by saying that. I am gonna put it here. I am gonna put it in Matt. It is kind of a slog, so like that's appropriate. And I do feel like overall there is more bad than good here, but because how well the game makes you enjoy playing through the actual court part, even if again it's mostly just nonsense, you are dealing with a lot of cool new cool elements in the magic stuff, and you're exploring some interesting mechanics along the way as you get a feel for the world and like defending someone in court in this way, in this world of magic and whatnot. And again, the emotional investment I had. I like Espella. I really like Espella as a character. She's like one of my favorite Ace Attorney characters across all 11 games. I'm not kidding. I'm not capping, bro. I'm putting half her cases in C tier, but I really do like Espella, so I'm emotionally invested defending her, and I felt bad for the killer. And like, the magic is cool and interesting, so even if a lot of the witnesses are just jokes and unenjoyable, and even if half the case, over half the case, is could she have just picked up the stick or not, the invisibility stuff was kind of cool, even if you ultimately figured stuff out, just because the stupid guy's name was whatever. I'm not gonna put it down here. I'm not, because I enjoyed playing this case. I enjoyed playing this case more than anything below it, so we're putting it there. Fortunately, this game is the exact opposite of Edgeworth 2, because oh boy does it ramp up after the first half. This case was mad interesting. For one, your immediate, okay, disclaimer, I don't remember like anything from the Layton half of this case. Almost anything. You kind of get an investigation segment though, because the death of the victim actually happened like a month or two ago or something like that. So you actually do get to go and investigate for once. And that's really interesting. You're starting to like pick up on some more of the plot points for the overarching story leading up to this case, including the great witch Espella. I get the great witch Espella. So that's real interesting. But this case starts off with Layton dying, or at least appearing to have died, because everything in this game isn't real. Absolute banger of a way to be thrown into the murder part of this case. And of course Maya is accused, because Maya has to be accused in every game of murder at least once, unless she's just not in it. I guarantee you, if Maya was in Apollo Justice or Maya was in Dual Destiny, she would have been accused of murder, I promise. But after you saw what just happened to Kira, you probably freaked out. I was freaked out. Seeing Maya in that cage definitely got the heart pumping. So this case had a lot of twists and turns. There was a lot of interesting spell nonsense in this game. This case pulled a Chihiro, where one of the witnesses turned out to be a girl, which meant that she could use magic. And it was just, in general, more interesting to play through. Like the whole hole through the wall thing. Once the hole in the wall spell became a thing, it was blatantly obvious what happened, because you saw that big green thing on the wall when you were investigating, that green paint. This case did a great job of convincing me that the one person was there who realistically could have done it, didn't do it. Because I feel like that butler, the girl pretending to be a guy who like lived with the victim, I don't remember her name, I'm gonna be honest, but that character was very dynamic. And I think that the extra layers to this case of the male, how like he was going to send his letter to the story master, and how it turned out that he had actually killed himself at the end, was a great twist that I didn't see coming, and it wasn't even all explored at the end of this case. This case also painted like that butler as someone you really were supposed to feel bad for. If she died, the game wanted to make you feel hesitant to push forward with your accusations, but you couldn't, because if you didn't, then Maya would die. So in some sense, it borrowed from the like, which is the worst evil? Convicting this girl of murder or letting Maya die? I think that it borrowed a lot of concepts from this case, and it didn't do them poorly. I was intrigued here. The actual content of the case was way more fun to play through with its twists and turns than either of these ones were. Unfortunately, this case also has the big drawback of having one of the key witnesses once again be some guy. Why did they do that, bro? Why did they have to do that to this case? I thought the witnesses were more interesting, even if more forgettable. It's interesting how that works. How, like, the witnesses being absolute, just worthless meme lords in this case made them more memorable than the actual more interesting witnesses in this case. Like, not counting, like, Jean Grey, or I think that was the culprit's name. Culprit. He didn't actually do it. Like, I think the twist where the guy actually killed himself was great, like, to reiterate. I thought that was really good, especially when you factor in everything you learn in this case. But aside from some guy, the witnesses were interesting. Luke probably has his best moments in this case. Luke is Professor Layton's sidekick, if any of you don't know. And he kind of is just tagging along for the ride most of the game. And this is the case where he really starts to get some good character moments, where he, like, begins to doubt that his friend Maya actually was it. He began to doubt her innocence, and he thought that maybe she was the one who killed the professor. Cutting the professor's arm off after he'd been turned into a gold statue? Crazy, man. What they did with that was very interesting. It really made you think he was dead too. Obviously he couldn't die, because I know Professor Layton has like 7 games or whatever, but I didn't know, man. Game did a great job of convincing me magic was real, and if magic was real, they could probably just resurrect the man, especially when you consider that at the end of this case, Maya falls into the flames, and you're like, okay, there has to be some sort of magic to resurrect the dead. I didn't think it was fake at first. I did not think it was fake. I thought that there had to be some magical way to fix all of this. So the game really had me going. I was falling for what it was putting down. The twist about how he felt about Jean Grey Earl, despite Grey Earl's assumptions when she peered through that hole in her room and saw him writing that letter, is very tragic, and I feel like that was very well written. Maya gets a hero moment at the end of the case, obviously, and she, like, gives her life for it. And Phoenix goes through this really depressive episode at the beginning of the next case. Jeez, that makes me realize just how long this case is. You figure out everything in this case. And it's also when you start to see Inquisitor Barnum start to say, maybe I'm a little in the wrong here. Maybe it's possible, potentially. But this case is also sadly a little disappointing. I feel like, again, they could have done so much more with the concepts of magic. The game did had me going with a lot of its ruses. I fall for a lot of them, and I feel like it made it a greater experience in the long run. It's so ironic how I think this case is so far the case with the least replayability in Professor Layton. It's also the one that I want to go back to the most. That's so weird. What they did with Grey Earl, oh my god, I'm bad with that name. Grey Earl and her master, like I said, I think was really well done. But how much cool stuff is in this case? Like, there's nothing in particular really stand out about this case. It's definitely above C tier. I'm gonna say that much though, for sure. There were a lot of twists and turns throughout. Defending Maya, customary, it's a classic. Also really like what they did with Luke here. But even so, I don't think there is anything really all that spectacular about this case. Seeing more of the magic was a lot of fun, but it still feels more like a middle of the road case, somewhere in B or C+. It's somewhere better than Edgeworth 1 and worse than Trials and Tribulations 3. It's somewhere in that range. By the way, speaking of third cases, this case does have the plus of being a third case that is generally good. Let's talk about third case syndrome for a little bit. Third cases generally dip in quality below everything that has come before them or after them in a lot of cases in the game. So props to this case for being a third case that's better than the first two. Edgeworth 2, also a great example of this. How they made the third case an unparalleled masterpiece and the best case in the game. I don't know how they did it. You know what? We're about to redo these tiers anyway. So for now, I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt a little. I'm gonna say it's a fairly decent case, because I think that's how I want to describe it. I'm gonna put it at the tail end of this tier, because putting this and this in the same tier feels wrong. This case, I still keep looking at it and wanting to put it up here. I really do, even though the execution was so lame. Like, how is it that the end of an Ace Attorney case leaves you with a darker pit in your stomach than the end of a Danganronpa case? Like a mid-game Danganronpa Ace Attorney case. How did that happen? This case ends, this case too, ends with you feeling worse than at the end of this case. Maybe it's because the end of this case is like when things start to turn around in DR1, but anyway, I'm gonna put it at the tail end of fairly decent. It's difficult for me to put it above this case just because Von Karma, going against Von Karma is in a lot of ways more enjoyable than anything in this case, but I feel like the standard of quality throughout is higher here. This is, unfortunately, the best way that Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright uses its magical concepts. This is the case where it shines the best in, which is again is very disappointing because the Ace Attorney writers messing around with magic could easily get up in here. Easily, I feel like, man. So even though they did some great stuff with some one-off characters here, like John Grey Earl and her master, I do think it just overall came out just good. Calling this case good hurts a lot more than like calling this case good, you know? Because calling this case good feels good. I feel like most people don't like this case. I love Lauren Pops. Badgerland is funny, introduces Kay, Little Thief mechanics, all that. I feel like calling this case good feels good, but calling this case good feels bad because it could have been so much better. And looking back, I feel like I enjoyed these cases so much more than where I'm putting them. And so it really hurts me to put them this low. I know, like I said, basically everything above this tier I could replay over and over. Everything in B or higher I like look forward to going back to, and how like I actually did enjoy everything much more than I didn't, unless it's in F. But it still hurts me to like look at these cases and have to rank them as low as I am, if that makes sense. But we don't have to do that for this case. This case, I didn't know Ace Attorney had the balls to do this ever. This ending is Danganronpa levels of crazy, and I couldn't love it more. They do so much wild crap. They have to do what Danganronpa does, where like a whole witness testimony is all just exposition, and every single line is a bomb that's dropped. This case is crazy. This case also has the record for most witnesses on the stand at a time. It's like a double-digit number. 10 or 11 knights get on the stand at the time, and that was actually really tricky, figuring out who was contradicting who and why. This case also has so many phases to it. This case starts in like an Indiana Jones segment where you go into this grassy land beyond the walls and you see all these dudes in cloaks doing such shit, and then you go into this temple underground and you figure out a bunch of lore, and then Espella's brainwashed again and she like thinks she's the Spella. There's so much going on. This case does so much in such a short period of time. There's backstories that get filled in. There's plot twists that get revealed. There's so many like layers to this case. This case feels like it has more acts to it than the rest of the game. This case is crazy, man. And holy crap, like I'm finally really glad that Layton is in the game. When Layton like steps into the courtroom, once you actually have to cross-examine the prosecutor, and Layton says, I can prove that Espella is Bezella, and you're like, bro, what is you doing? You betrayed me. The game finally lived up to its name. It's Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright, and my god, am I glad that when it happened, I was playing as Phoenix Wright. Holy crap. This case was so, oh my god, phenomenal experience. I loved what they did here, and they did so much here. The mind control, it paid off. They did so much with it. It was great. I loved it. And there was like so much backstory to every character too. The story writer, to this man who died, he got a lot of backstory. By the way, this is the only character in the game who actually died. All these murder cases, this was an assault case. Neither the victims nor the killer who was executed in this case actually died. Maya didn't actually die. They pulled so many debates in this case. It was such a wild ride. Going up against Prosecutor Darklaw was crazy and like super hype to begin with. And this was before Layton steps in. Man, the judge doesn't even know what's going on. He doesn't know what he's doing with his life and career, man. When the secrets behind Storybrooke finally get revealed, it's like nothing you ever knew has ever been this crazy. It's so wild and ridiculous, and they really took a risk by going as far with this as they did. I don't even want to spoil a lot of it, because in the grand scheme of Ace Attorney, right, these cases, lower tier cases in the grand scheme, C, B, for everything else in the game. Bro, go play this game just for this case alone. I don't even want to talk too much about it, because I bet most of you haven't played this game, and this case is so crazy. Look it up on YouTube or something. The payoff you get, the wow moments are so, they're great. There's so much. You reveal so much in this case. Nothing that the game sets up has any payoff in like any of these first 3 cases. My God, does it pay off when you get to this case. So this is gonna be one of my hottest takes of the day, probably one of my hottest takes of the list, but so far, this is top 3 best cases for me. This case is an unparalleled masterpiece. This case did so much. Everything this case did, I love. I was invested in every aspect of it. Espella gets backstory. The storyteller gets backstory. It turns out he's her dad, because of course he is. This dude over here was Darklaw's dad. The backstory that Darklaw shares with Espella isn't at all what you would have expected. And it's so intricate, and I love the twist that they do with it. And it's all done in this epic climax where everything is revealed to not be what you think it is, and they just do so much with the world and flipping everything you know on its head. And wow, you're finally going against Professor Layton, like the title of the game leads you to believe will happen. At first, I'm just like, oh, they just called it Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright because it's a cool way to name the game. They're actually friends. They don't go against each other. But no, it actually happens. There is actual payoff there. And this is also the first part of the game where playing as Layton is actually really interesting, and the puzzles are really interesting. Getting to explore the storyteller's mansion, that confrontation between Layton and the storyteller, and like he calls knights and you actually get attacked. Holy crap, this case is cool, so damn cool. It's so cool. I love it. I effing love it. It's a top 3 case. It's an unparalleled masterpiece. I would recommend this whole game, which honestly, despite its amazing, magical, fantastical elements of magic that it tries to use, seems kind of mid up to this point. It's very enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but compared to mainline Ace Attorney, kind of mid up to this point, nah. This is such a powerful payoff. Holy crap, I can't praise this enough. This ending is worth playing it for. It's worth playing it through a second time for. Edgeworth even has a cameo at the very end, a voiced cameo.
Hold it! What's the matter, Wright? Has the cat got your tongue? Or are you still in a holiday kind of mood? Perhaps your mind is as clouded as the English sky.
That's so cool! They really pulled out all the stops to make the climax of this game fun, memorable, crazy, all the loose ends tied up, and there's a lot of loose ends. And you do a lot of investigation leading up to this case. You even cut back and forth between Layton and Phoenix. Once the actual case gets started, that's so interesting. I don't like Layton segments. I don't. I think I've made it clear by now. But cutting back and forth between Phoenix and Layton in the way that this case does also makes this case feel so much better paced than any other chapter in the game. If only the whole game could live up to this standard. I mean, I think it was pretty obvious at this point that the storyteller wasn't actually dead when he died, so that was kind of predictable. And I think that's just because at this point you realize that the game is debating you when it comes to character death in this game, because Maya obviously doesn't die here. But this keeps you on the edge of your seat. Some tricky cross-examinations too. Lots of statements to keep track of, lots of witnesses. I felt like there was actual genuine challenge, and honestly, I feel like that was a great theme throughout the game. I feel like some of the challenge in like every case after the initial case was some of the most fair, genuine challenge in Ace Attorney. It really makes you think. It really made me think. Sometimes Ace Attorney challenge is bullshit. This case, oh my god, it is stupidly unfair when you're talking about how Lauren's father, the butler, and her knew or didn't know that they were a father-daughter, or what was in that stupid guitar case in this case. There's some BS moments in cases. There's one in Danganronpa 2, and I think we might rank Danganronpa 2 next, so we'll bring that up pretty soon. But this game, all the way through, I felt like nailed the challenge aspect of the cross-examinations really well. I really enjoyed thinking about it, and there were some that were some toughies, and by the time that I actually figured it out after really thinking on it for a while, I was like really satisfied. It didn't feel like BS in the same way that some of the other difficult points throughout Ace Attorney have felt like. So difficulty was another thing that this case does really well. Holy crap, this case is amazing. It's phenomenal. I don't care what you think. You're probably typing in the comments that I'm capping right now. No, I promise you, this case is phenomenal. It's so good. It's amazing. I loved it. I'm so glad Ace Attorney decided to do something like this. That they decided to say F it and just do some things that they might have had some reservations about doing something on this level in the mainline games. I'm so glad this game exists if it's only for this climax. This is such a great conclusion. I loved it. Unparalleled masterpiece, just out of nowhere. After, like, this being the best in the game up till now. Unparalleled masterpiece. All right, so now it's time to do what I promised and reevaluate. Oh, what the F did I just do? And like reevaluate everything from A+, maybe to like B. Give me a few moments to like really look and think about these.
A few moments later.
If there was a time for me to move Danganronpa 1-4, it would be now, I guess. I don't really like it, but I'm gonna do it just because, like, okay. Clarification. There is a huge gap between this case and this case. That's really why I didn't want to put them in the same tier, because I really feel like this gap right here is worth being a difference in tier for, but there's no question that this case is better than this case, and that this case just doesn't really live up to the overall real solid tier. I think it is more of a good, fairly decent case, and the reason that I didn't want to put it here is because I also feel there's like a big gap between this and the rest of this tier. So it almost makes me want to put these two in their own tier between A and B, like B+. Right? It feels really wrong having this case next to this case, because this case, I really do feel like this case is just so much better. In the same sense that I feel like this case is just so much better than the rest of this tier, and I really want to say it's overall real solid, but this is a much better descriptor, and this case is better than this case. So that's really what's been bothering me, and I really don't like placing either of these here because they're in the same tier as other cases that I really don't think they should be in the same tier as. But I think, to be perfectly honest, I have to leave them here. Leave this case here in real solid overall, because it is real solid overall. And I really didn't want to dip this case down into the same tier as Edgeworth 1-3 and 1-5, but upon further reflection, I just have to. There's nothing super great about this case that makes me put it in real solid overall. It doesn't have moments like these cases do. I feel like my reasoning for putting this case in this tier is because it's like very reminiscent of this case, at least in my eyes. Not necessarily any particular standout moments, but just real solid overall. But I shouldn't be making that comparison between these two, because this case just does it on such a much better level than this case. So I have to put it down there. I think that's all I really want to change for now. I could maybe bump this up, like above this. But this is such a great opening, and I don't want to do that. It also does a lot more with a lot less. And I know that my opinion on cases that do that hasn't exactly been really consistent, but I think that in this case's case, it deserves praise for what it does like that. Part of me thinks that this case should be above this case, but I don't know, should it? Nah, this case is definitely a tier above this, and I do like Callisto Yu's introduction even more than I like Maya's, which is unfortunate because of how Callisto Yu kind of gets shafted as a character. We're gonna leave it like that for now. Yeah, this looks so much better, but I just can't do it. This is more accurate. That's how it is. It's the only correct way to do it. I can't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Cammy Neal. I can't. The writers probably don't even want me to anyway. The writers clearly hated you. All right, what should we do next? Let's take a break from Ace Attorney. How many Ace Attorney games do we have left? We have like 5 left. The Apollo Justice Trilogy and then the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. I think we're gonna save the Apollo Justice Trilogy for last. I want to do Great Ace Attorney Chronicles next, and I want to take a break before we do that. We also have like these one-off cases down here. Y'all are probably wondering why some of this stuff's even here. Let's do some of these. Let's do the Freddi Fish cases. Let's do the Freddi Fish cases. It's a funny segue. So, the Freddi Fish, okay, y'all are probably typing all kinds of memes in the comments right now. It's like, why are these games even here? These are the first cases that I ever played. I played these when I was a very young child, and they are genuine cases. And what I mean by that, and the reason that I put this case in unrankable, is that, yes, this is about a case that you have to, like, find clues and figure out, but you don't actually have to solve anything. You just progress through the game and whatnot. This case, at the very end, you actually have to point out who the killer is, or not the killer. Can you imagine killers in Freddi Fish? You have to point out who the thief is. By the way, domestic case, freaking Mazda Mask 2 up in here, 3, I guess. There's a Mazda Mask Edgeworth. You actually have to point out who the killer is. Or, I said it again, who the thief is. So this is like the first case I ever solved. Freddi Fish 1 and 2 weren't anything like this, by the way. And so because of that, I had to put it on this list. These are point and click adventure games for the most part, and you don't really have to think much until you're at the climax of the game. So in a lot of ways, I want to put this as unrankable too, because the only thing you really have to do in Freddi Fish 3 and Freddi Fish 4, let's just do them both, since this applies to both of these games, is that after you have played through the game and like gotten a bunch of clues and whatnot, and the game reaches its climax, you find a decisive piece of evidence, and you have to remember who that belongs to. And if you remember and you point out who's the owner of it correctly, then basically you beat the game, and there is a logical explanation for who it was. And these games are unique in the sense that every time you play them, the culprit is different, which is very interesting. I feel like other games could have like endings like this. Probably the most memorable instance of me playing a game like that is Star Wars Force Unleashed 2, where whether like Darth Vader made a clone of Starkiller or whether he's actually him, the complete backstory of the game and what's true and what's not depends on your choices. And it turns out that things are just completely true or false depending on your choices, and it's just completely different endings. I know it's not really directly comparable, but it would be so interesting to have more cases where the culprit is different each time you play. And because it's something that you only figure out at the very end of the case, the characters can give actual logical reasons for why it is each different person that it could be, so that each different culprit seems like, yes, it was actually that person. That's what actually happened. Of course, this also detracts from the game in the sense that it can't really set it up being that one person at all until the very end of the game. But the games are just fun to play through. These are kids' games, and I think that even to this day, these games are very fun to play through. I could have fun playing through one of these games again. Humongous Entertainment is what got me into Let's Playing and doing YouTube in the first place. Yes, it was because of these games. I had to include them on the list. But do I put them in unrankable just because there's like so little content that you actually have to solve? They're fun to play through. There's like Layton-ish puzzles. I know I didn't like take the Layton part of these games into consideration to that much, but there's some interesting stuff here, and they're not outright bad. These games are not outright bad. Absolutely not. I guarantee you no other human being on this planet has compared these cases to these cases before, ever. I'm the first one, bro. I'm proud to be the first one. But obviously they are for kids. They don't have the same complex plot lines as all these cases do. I think Freddi Fish 3 is an average experience. If you were to play it as an adult, it's cute, it's fun, it's average. There's more good than bad. Playing it through for the first time, it's a fun little experience. It's not often that you play story games as a kid that are still entertaining as an adult. But if you walked up to me and said, let's play Freddi Fish 3, I'd be down for that. It's so freaking stupid. have been funny to talk about. But in a lot of ways, it's a good, fairly decent experience, but I ain't putting it above this case. Hell no. I know that y'all are all probably pissed that I put this case as low as it did. I couldn't do this. Y'all would all dislike the video if I did that. I can't do that. We're putting it here. I don't like Freddi Fish 4 nearly as much. I don't think it is nearly as fun to play as Freddi Fish 3. The case solving aspect is like exactly the same, right? You have to figure out who it is at the end based on one decisive piece of evidence. But I think that the road leading up to the end of the game isn't nearly as fun to play through in Freddi Fish 4. I don't think it aged as well, and this game also isn't nearly as fun to play through an adult as this game is. Maybe it's just nostalgia. I was gonna put it like here or here, but upon further reflection, I don't think I'd have nearly as much fun coming back to this game, so I'm gonna put it in D tier. And like I said, it's very difficult to compare these games to like the rest of the cases on this list. It's ridiculous in a lot of ways, but this is mostly for fun. I'm having fun doing it. And like, after all, I am comparing Freddi Fish mostly in terms of gameplay as opposed to like as a case when I'm comparing it to like everything else on this list. If I did that, I could put Persona 5 Royal like up here. I think that anybody could, because this game is an unparalleled masterpiece. But because you don't actually have to do any of the actual case solving, that's why it's an unrankable. You technically have to solve the case in these games. That's why they get on the list. And by the way, we're gonna talk about this when we get to this case, or this case. Don't let me forget, because I do want to bring this back up. I know y'all can't actually remind me, but don't let me forget. I can't believe I just ranked Freddi Fish on this list. What am I doing with my life, man? And you know what the crazy thing is, bro? I don't think we're even half done. I don't think we're even half done. We still have like 60 cases left to talk about, man.